The year was 1907, and in a luxurious New York office overlooking Wall Street, one of America's most powerful bankers was reading disturbing reports. Jacob Schiff was worried. Not about money, he had plenty, but about people. Jacob Schiff was Jewish, and he'd immigrated to America from Germany decades earlier. Now, he was watching a crisis unfold in New York City's Lower East Side. Thousands of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, were crammed into tenement buildings in one of the most overcrowded neighborhoods in the world. Why were they all there? They were fleeing pogroms, organized violent attacks on Jewish communities in the Russian Empire. Imagine armed mobs storming through your neighborhood, burning homes, destroying businesses, beating people, sometimes killing them, all because of their religion. The Russian government didn't just allow these attacks, sometimes they encouraged them. Between 1881 and 1914, millions of Jews fled the Russian Empire. Most ended up in New York, because that's where the ships from Europe arrived. By 1907, the Lower East Side had become so densely packed that some blocks had over 700 people per acre, more crowded than the worst slums of Bombay or Calcutta. Jacob Schiff saw two problems with this. First, the conditions were terrible. Families of 6 or 8 people lived in 2-room apartments with no running water. Disease spread rapidly. Children worked in sweatshops instead of going to school. It was no way to live. Second, and this really worried Schiff, the concentration of so many poor Jewish immigrants in one place was fueling anti-Semitism. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting Jewish immigrants as disease-carrying vermin. Politicians called for restrictions on immigration. Schiff feared that if something didn't change, America might close its doors to Jewish refugees entirely, condemning thousands more to face the pogroms back in Russia. So Schiff came up with an audacious plan. What if Jewish immigrants didn't come through New York at all? Schiff's idea was revolutionary. Use Galveston, Texas as an alternative entry point. Land Jewish refugees there, then quickly disperse them throughout the American West and Midwest to places like Kansas City, Omaha, Denver, and St. Louis. Instead of creating another ghetto, spread people out where they could start fresh in places desperate for skilled workers. He called it the Galveston Movement, though it was also known as the Galveston Plan. Some Jewish historians would later call it West of Hester Street, referring to the famous street in New York's Jewish quarter that these immigrants would never see. But Schiff couldn't just announce this plan publicly. If he did, it might look like he was trying to dump Jewish immigrants in Texas, which could create political backlash. So the operation was organized quietly, almost secretly, through a network of Jewish charitable organizations. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Recruitment in Russia. The Jewish Territorial Organization, ITO, in London sent recruiters into the Pale of Settlement, the region of the Russian Empire where Jews were legally confined. These recruiters didn't just take anyone. They specifically looked for young men and women with useful trades: carpenters, tailors, shoemakers, butchers, bakers, blacksmiths, people who could start businesses in small American towns. The recruiters were careful to be honest about where people were going. This wasn't New York with its existing Jewish community and Yiddish newspapers. This was Texas and the American West. Smaller cities, fewer Jews, but more opportunity. Step 2. The journey to Bremen. Selected families were given tickets to travel to Bremen, Germany, where they would board ships of the North German Lloyd Line. The Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden, German Jewish Aid Society, managed their transit through Germany, making sure they had kosher food, medical care, and proper documentation. Step 3. The Atlantic Crossing. Unlike the horrific sailing ships that brought earlier immigrants, these refugees traveled on modern steamships like the SS Frankfurt and SS Köln. The journey still took about 2 weeks, but conditions were vastly better than the Maria that had carried the Czechs 50 years earlier. There was still seasickness, crowding, and fear, but at least there was a functioning galley, medical care, and the knowledge that someone was waiting for them on the other side. Step 4. Arrival in Galveston. This is where the plan became truly unique. When the ships docked in Galveston, the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau, JIIB, swung into action. The JIIB had an office right near the port, staffed by people who spoke Yiddish, Russian, and Polish. Unlike other immigrants who might linger in Galveston for weeks, the Jewish refugees were processed within 24 to 48 hours. The JIIB had already identified job opportunities in various Western cities. If you were a tailor, there might be a clothing factory in Kansas City that needed workers. If you were a kosher butcher, perhaps a Jewish community in Denver needed your services. The JIIB bought train tickets, provided a bit of money for food during the journey, and literally put people on trains heading west. Schiff didn't want to create a Galveston ghetto. He wanted dispersal. One of the immigrants who came through Galveston in 1907 was listed on the SS Köln manifest simply as Joiner, a carpenter, from near Kiev. His grandson, Calvin Trillin, would grow up to become a famous American writer. Years later, Trillin reflected on how strange his family's path to America was. Getting on a boat in darkest Europe, getting off in Galveston, Texas, and going straight to St. Joseph, Missouri. Not New York, not Chicago, St. Joseph, Missouri, a city most Americans couldn't find on a map. But that was exactly the point. In St. Joseph, the Trillin family could start a business without competing against thousands of other Jewish immigrants. They could become part of the community rather than being isolated in an ethnic ghetto. Young Calvin could grow up as an American kid who happened to be Jewish, rather than a Jewish kid who happened to be in America. Another arrival was Alexander Gurwitz, a shohit, kosher ritual slaughterer, and Hebrew teacher from Belarus. Unlike many immigrants who arrived destitute, Gurwitz brought what sociologists call cultural capital, education, religious knowledge, and skills the Jewish community needed. In his memoir, Memories of Two Generations, Gurwitz describes arriving in Galveston and being amazed by the heat, the palm trees, and the sight of the Gulf of Mexico, all completely alien to someone from the forests of Belarus. He was quickly sent to San Antonio, where he helped establish that city's kosher meat supply and taught Hebrew to the children of earlier Jewish settlers. Gurwitz's story shows that the Galveston movement wasn't just about rescuing the poor, though it did that. It was also about building religious and cultural infrastructure in Western Jewish communities that desperately needed teachers, rabbis, and religious functionaries. Not every story was a success. Some immigrants found the smaller Western cities isolating. In New York, you could walk down a street and hear nothing but Yiddish. You could buy a Yiddish newspaper on every corner. There were synagogues, kosher bakeries, and a whole cultural world. In a place like Omaha or Fort Worth in 1910, the Jewish community might number only a few hundred families. Some immigrants, especially older ones who didn't speak English well, felt lost and alone. A few even saved money to move to New York, where they felt more at home despite the crowding. Young people generally adapted better. Kids learned English in school, made friends with non-Jewish neighbors, and grew up as Westerners. But for their parents and grandparents, the adjustment could be painful. No account of the Galveston movement would be complete without mentioning Rabbi Henry Cohen, one of the most remarkable figures in Texas history. Rabbi Cohen led Congregation B'nai Israel in Galveston, and he took the arrival of Jewish immigrants as a personal mission. When ships carrying Jewish refugees docked, Rabbi Cohen was often there on the wharf, dressed in his black coat despite the sweltering heat. He became a one-man aid society. If an immigrant needed money, Rabbi Cohen pulled it from his own pocket or from congregant donations. If someone was sick, he personally escorted them to the hospital. If immigration officials threatened to deport someone for medical reasons, Rabbi Cohen argued their case and usually won. There are legendary stories about Rabbi Cohen. Once, immigration officials wanted to deport a young man because he had a minor eye infection. Rabbi Cohen argued so passionately that they relented, and that young man went on to become a successful businessman who never forgot the rabbi who saved him. Another time, a family arrived with no money and no prospects. Rabbi Cohen personally found the father a job, secured housing for the family, and even collected furniture from community members so they'd have something to sit on. He learned to speak multiple languages, Yiddish, German, Russian, so he could communicate directly with immigrants in their own tongues. Rabbi Cohen didn't see this as charity. He saw it as tzedakah, a Jewish concept that means something more than charity. It means justice, righteousness, the obligation to help others. Between 1907 and 1914, approximately 10,000 Jewish immigrants entered America through Galveston. That might not sound like much compared to the millions who came through New York, but the impact was significant. The dispersal strategy meant that Jewish communities sprouted or grew in dozens of cities across the West and Midwest. Small towns that had maybe a handful of Jewish families suddenly had enough for a proper synagogue, a Hebrew school, a Jewish cemetery. The Galveston arrivals provided the critical mass needed for Jewish life to flourish in these places. Because the JIIB carefully matched immigrants with existing job opportunities, the newcomers were economically productive almost immediately. A tailor who arrived on Monday might be working in a shop by Wednesday. This rapid integration helped counter anti-immigrant sentiment. People could see that these newcomers were contributing, not just taking. The Jewish immigrants brought their own traditions, foods, and customs, adding to Texas's growing cultural diversity. Kosher delis, synagogues with distinctive Eastern European architectural styles, Yiddish theater performances, all became part of the Texas landscape, particularly in cities like Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. Jewish immigrants placed enormous value on education, often pushing their children to excel academically, even when the family was poor. This emphasis on learning contributed to higher literacy rates and academic achievement in communities with significant Jewish populations. In August 1914, everything changed. World War I broke out in Europe, and transatlantic passenger shipping effectively stopped. The carefully organized pipeline from the Russian Pale through Bremen to Galveston was severed. The Galveston movement never resumed after the war. By the 1920s, America had passed strict immigration quota laws that dramatically reduced the number of people allowed to enter from Eastern Europe. The Golden Door, whether in New York or Galveston, had largely closed. But for those 10,000 people who did make it through, and for their descendants, the Galveston Movement changed everything. It meant the difference between a life trapped in the Russian Empire and the horrors that would come there in the following decades, and a new life in America. The Galveston Movement was different from other immigration waves we've discussed. It wasn't spontaneous or chaotic. It was carefully planned, thoughtfully executed, and motivated by a combination of practical concerns, preventing overcrowding, and genuine compassion, saving people from persecution. It showed that immigration doesn't have to be a crisis. With proper organization, adequate resources, and willing communities, immigrants can be successfully integrated in ways that benefit everyone. Today, when you meet a Jewish Texan whose family has been in the state for generations, there's a good chance their great-grandparents came through Galveston. They might not even know the details: how Jacob Schiff orchestrated their family's escape from Russia, how Rabbi Cohen might have personally greeted them, how they were part of a grand experiment in demographic engineering. But they're living proof that sometimes the road less traveled, in this case, the route through Galveston instead of New York, makes all the difference. Be sure to hit like and subscribe to continue this journey through the Golden Door and find out how other groups immigrated to Texas through Galveston. Let me know in the comments what you think so far, and what other parts of history would you like to see covered. Until next time, stay curious.